One of the best things about the pre-game of a new Pokemon game is trying to predict what's coming our way. It usually helps getting actual information about said game, but 2026 appears to be a very dry year, sadly. But anyway, hey, I'm Not So a Strainer, welcome back to the channel, and could this Filipino myth actually have inspired winds and waves? Let's get into it. Pokemon stories are often taken from various mythologies, and even if a region has a very clear inspiration on a specific culture, it doesn't mean that everything there will be related to it at all. For example, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem draw from Taoism, an ancient Chinese philosophy, despite being in Gen 5 in a region inspired by New York. The creation myth of Pokemon with Arceus creating Dialga, Palkia, and all that is related to Shintoism, which is Japanese in origin and does fit the region of Sinnoh. But then all the architecture surrounding that is very much Greek/Roman inspired, not to mention Giratina being banished is clearly alluding to the fallen angel Lucifer. There are many examples of the actual region inspiration being more of a way to design the visual elements and not as much like connected to the lore of that place. I mean, we did have Decotora trucks in an Iberian Peninsula inspired region in Paldea. So with winds and waves primarily being inspired by Indonesia and all of its islands, it will look like it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will have its myths and lore and folklore and everything, but it also doesn't mean that it won't. So I started reading about Indonesian folklore and mythology, trying to find a story that felt like it fit. Like for example, Momotaro's story in the Teal Mask with the peach, the pheasant, monkey and dog, and also the Oni. But I couldn't find anything in Indonesian folklore that I could tie to what we know about this game and that satisfied me. There are many folktales, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of them, but nothing is speaking to me. Yes, the Naga can possibly be the Legendaries and the Lembuswana the third Legendary like I mentioned on a couple of videos, but there's no story to connect them. The Genderuwo exists, but that's basically Grimmsnarl, and then there's also way too many creatures that have their insides hanging out for whatever reason. So before I went to random countries in the world, I looked at Southeast Asia first, and the Philippines actually had a pretty cool story, a creation myth that had the sky, the sea, and a third entity that connected it all. Visayan folklore states that at one point in time, in the beginning of things, two gods claimed superiority over each other, the god of the sky, Katan, and the god of the sea, Mangwayan. But everything was fine and no conflict really existed. But one huge bird, Manao, wanted a place to rest because he was tired of endlessly flying, so he asked both gods for a place to do so. But they couldn't care less, and so Manao dove into the sea and found there was land underneath. And so he devised a very successful plan to start a war between the two gods. The war raged on and kept bringing more of that land to the surface, but it wouldn't allow him to stop and rest as he wanted. So Manao ripped boulders from now visible mountains and hurled them at the two gods, eventually stopping the war. Those boulders that fell down on the waters floated and created the islands of the Philippines. Now, the Philippines are not Indonesia, I do know that, but the region itself might not just be Indonesia, but actually a Southeast Asian region. Kinda like Paldea was an Iberian region, mostly Spain, but with a little bit of Portugal. But anyway, like I mentioned previously, it doesn't really matter in the end, anything can happen. But if we do follow this creation myth theory, this Philippine story theory, we can actually speculate a few more things. Since Manal was a huge bird, it's possible the same thing happens in Pokemon Winds and Pokemon Waves for the third Legendary. The Sky God would be the Winds Legendary, possibly Mr. Winnichu, and the Sea God would be the Waves Legendary, possibly Mrs. Wavichu. Then, that Trickster bird would be the third Legendary, and the reason why, in the past, those two had been at war with each other. Trickster bird also makes me think Dark Flying, even though that's very Yveltal-like. There's also another possibility, of course, and this one goes back to a few comments I got when I first discussed this game's legendary Pokemon, and that is that every one of the gods is a bird, and we actually get new forms for Lugia, which is kinda already seen as a sea god of sorts, and Ho-Oh, especially since it feels like everyone from back in the day has forms or something similar. The Galarian birds exist, Mewtwo has Mega Evolutions, the Paradox Beasts offer new takes on the legendary beast designs, Groudon and Kyogre have Primals, and Rayquaza has a Mega. but they'd never make those two the main legendaries of this game, so it might just be a side story. Either way, this Visayan creation myth is the best Southeast Asian story I could find to connect the sky winds with the sea waves, and it also offered us a third entity, a possibility for a third legendary. But what about you? Do you know of any story that could fit this concept of winds and waves? Or better yet, do you think they'll ever do Ho-Oh and Lugia with new forms? Because why the hell not? Let me know down below. And now, that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all on the next one. But before I go, I want to thank my YouTube members Good Old Deo, Dash Plays, and Attila Santo, and my Twitch subscribers and newbies here, the Dr. Joe, Teixeira23, Lazarix, and Odd Cypher for going that extra mile. Thank you so much for all of your support.